Okay, we should probably start to respect all of you who did join on time. Welcome. I am Ruth Langer. I am the Jim Bernauer's successor as the interim director now for the Center for Christian Jewish Learning. And I have the great pleasure right now of welcoming you, introducing the talk, but before we get to that, doing some housekeeping announcements. Please do keep yourselves muted while people are speaking. That prevents us from having feedback and background noise. And during questions and answers, if there's a verbal question, then obviously you'll have a chance to unmute yourself and to hang around at the end and speak to Jim personally as well if you would like. We are going to handle questions first and foremost and primarily through the chat that you'll find at the bottom of your screen. If you click on the word that says chat, then a window will open and you'll have a place there to type questions for Jim into the chat. We have one of my graduate students who will be collecting your questions from Zoom and communicating them to me, and then I will then be able to communicate them primarily to Jim Bernauer, but also to the respondents if you would like. I need to let you know that this event is being recorded and it will be publicly available soon on our website and through our social media. Names do not appear on the recordings at least from Boston College Zoom. And so the speakers will be glad to be able to see at least some of your faces. But if you don't want to be appearing on the video at all, please turn off your camera with the stop video button on your screen. We will be trying to spotlight the video of the speaker, as you should see right now. And you'll be able to also control that a little bit on the top right of your screen if you're on a computer by switching out of gallery view and into the single square, which will show just one person at a time. So we are gathered today in order to celebrate the book that Professor James Bernauer published, that you can see the picture of its cover on the screen, called Jesuit Kaddish, Jesuits, Jews, and Holocaust Remembrance. This book appeared just before the pandemic broke loose. Indeed, Jim left a copy in my mailbox, which I happened to pick up after classes went on Zoom last March, because I needed to run into my office and decided to check my mail. I read this book with enormous pleasure, and so it's a real privilege for us to be able to gather now to celebrate this book and to celebrate Jim's 12 years of service to the Center for Christian Jewish Learning as its director before his retirement last spring. James Bernauer, as you know, is a member of the Society of Jesus. He is the Kraft Family Professor of Philosophy Emeritus and former director of the Center for Christian Jewish Learning at Boston College. He retired, as I just said, but before his retirement, he spent 40 years in the philosophy department at Boston College, and then the last 12 of those also with our center. He's the author, editor, and co-editor of a number of books, including The Tragic Couple, Encounters Between Jews and Jesuits. His fields of interest include Holocaust studies, Jesuits and Jews during the Holocaust, German Jewry, and the philosophies of Michel Foucault and Hannah Arendt. I'm going to ask Jim now to speak for about half an hour. And then after he speaks, I will introduce the two respondents who will speak briefly, responding to what he's had to say, and then there will be chances for questions. So a reminder, if questions arise to you during the talks, just write them in the chat, and we will see them and collect them for actual presentation to Jim, asking Jim questions. Jim, it's your turn.
Thank you very much. I'll try not to make it a full half hour, but we'll see. This is a great privilege for me. And I want to thank, first of all, Ruth Langer, professor in the Theology department, and Dr. Camille Markey, the associate director of the center, for having the center sponsor this event. We had originally planned this last April, but and I already had picked out the various wines that I know some of you are connoisseurs of, but we've had to change our plans slightly. I also want to thank our respondents, Professor Susanna Heschel and Father Brett McLaughlin. I know both of them, and I'm eager to continue to learn from them today. I'm also very grateful to you in the Zoom community, internationally and locally. We have a beautiful day here in Massachusetts today. In Boston, it's got a real feel of fall on it. But I want to thank you for taking the time to tune in and express your interest in this work. My book is a study of the Jesuit order's hostility to Judaism and Jews, and it's arisen from the perspective of what eventually becomes the Holocaust, how this theological way of thinking, not just theological, fed into the destruction of European Jews in Europe. It's not a complete account because it really touches on Poland for very complicated reasons that I can't really get into now, in addition to the fact that I don't know Polish. But I do know Polish historians, and I learned about all the difficulties of doing Polish history in a post-communist society. But I'm very pleased that the very first published review of it has already appeared in Polish, which is very early for a book to get reviews, if any get reviews. And there is a review in Polish, a very favorable review. And I'm in conversation now with a Polish historian there about a possible translation of the book and the addition of a chapter to it by this Polish historian on the situation of Jews and Jesuits in Poland during the 20th century in particular. Although it's not a full account, it is an effort to touch the essential moments in the development of this anti-Jewish hostility and try to account for it. It also throws light, however, on those Jesuit voices internal to the society who called into question what was being done in this polemical discourse in the society, the critics. Now, one of my colleagues claimed that the only reason I was doing that is because it was consoling in the light of this history to focus on those Jesuits who actually spoke out against what was happening. Especially the Jesuits have come to admire immensely those who have been honored by Israel's institution Yad Vashem for having risked their lives or lost their lives trying to save Jewish life. And that's certainly true. There's a certain truth in my colleague's remark that it was consoling. If you read about this polemical discourse, it's very discouraging that Christians would be thinking this way about another people. And this other Jesuit group did not think that way, and they managed to break through that rhetoric. Now, the other reason, though, which I've come to appreciate in light of that criticism it wasn't really meant as a criticism, it was a comment from my colleague. I've come to recognize that you really can't understand the polemics unless you understand those who resisted that polemic, because they're the ones who are identifying what's really being said in this discourse. And I didn't fully appreciate that until I actually got into it, that if you want to really understand what some of the Catholic theologians were saying about Judaism, you really need another theologian to say, well, that's nonsense. That's not Catholic theology. And I found in especially the work of Henri de Lubac, the French Jesuit theologian, a real brilliance in how he dealt with this misuse of theology that we had just become so familiar with in the Catholic tradition. So with that sort of an introduction, I'm going to deal briefly with 4 questions. First, why did I write the book? 2, why the title Jesuit Kaddish? And 3, were there distinctive traits both to Jesuit anti-Jewish hostility as well as to the internal Jesuit criticism of that polemic? Were there distinctive traits? And of course there were. And 4th, what were some of the surprises for me that developed in the course of my research? And if there's enough time, I'll mention, perhaps with some measure of detail, a Jesuit statement of possible repentance that could be made, similar to some of the statements that the Pope has made and that Episcopal Bishops' conferences have made. In general, those conferences have taken the place of smaller religious groupings in the Catholic Church, and in the eyes of some, have excused those smaller groups from speaking. So Mike, let me first take the question of why did I write the book? And there were reasons both personal and academic. Personally, I felt a certain debt, a double debt. First to the Jewish community. I've been very influenced by the Jewish community over the years. You can probably recognize by my lingering New York accent that I grew up in New York City, and I was very influenced by the Jewish ethos of New York. And I've had a lot of experience over the years with Jewish concerns. I mean, when I was a college student, I was invited to participate in a seminar, Jewish theological, on the topic of interreligious dialogue. I went to SUNY Stony Brook, where I had many fine Jewish professors, philosophers. And I recalled even just this morning thinking out this notion of debt that I had to the Jewish community. The first academic event I went to as a young college student was to the memorial service for Martin Buber. And it was held in New York in a Protestant church. And it was the one time I saw Paul Tillich, who spoke there shortly before I think he died, shortly after that. Now I've tried to pay that debt, in part by my teaching. I've taught regularly courses in the Holocaust. I've taught on German Jewish culture. I've taught on Martin Buber and Hannah Arendt. So I felt that in my work, my classroom work, I've tried to convey a sense of the depth of Jewish intellectualism that I've been exposed to. The other group I felt indebted to, of course, were the Jesuits, who had fought against this anti-Jewish polemic. And there were many of those that I learned about as I studied this history. And I lived with some of them in Paris, especially in the Jesuit community in Paris, where several of the members of the community were resistors who had gone to concentration camps, who had been imprisoned in the Gestapo prisons, and 2 of whom who were honored by the state by Yad Vashem in Israel as being righteous Gentiles. So I felt a certain debt to them, and I still feel that debt to them. That's the personal side on why I wrote the book. The academic side, perhaps immodestly, is I thought it was needed by the Jesuits, because this is a history that's really not known by Jesuits. And there are a variety of reasons for that, but it's very few people, very few Jesuits would even be able to identify some of those who have been honored by Yad Vashem, even though the general who was the head of the order, who was elected right after the Second World War, was one of those honored. I was surprised to have an encounter recently by email with a Roman official who found that very surprising. And in the Jesuit Encyclopedia, which came out, 4-volume work came out a few years ago, when they take up this general, this fact is not at all mentioned. So there's a sort of eclipse of our Jewish relationships in the Jesuits. There was a book we had in the Jesuit community coffee room here that some of us used to regularly comment on, because it was written, it was an encyclopedia of Jesuit activities in German, and it was published in 1934. And one of the essays that people would regularly mention was one that took pride in the fact that those of Jewish ancestry were not allowed in the Society of Jesus. And we used to have casual conversations about this over coffee, but that book has disappeared after we renovated St. Mary's. I haven't been able to find it again. But again, it just testifies that Jesuit-Jewish relations were on the periphery, and very few knew the history. The other factor, and this is perhaps immodest as well, for the academic reason, I think it was needed by the church, that to understand the church's response during the period of the Holocaust, I think the Jesuits are central to the influence. Pius XII has been the focus on so much scholarship, but rarely has it been mentioned that Pius XII surrounded himself with Jesuits. And the reason he did, according to a diary, a very important diary that's rarely commented upon, is they would be obedient, and they were not going to raise questions to him once he made a decision. And in this diary, a person who knew Pius XII quite well, he said Pius XII did not like strong men around him. So that's why he never replaced his Cardinal Secretary of State, for example. He wanted people who would obey, and he also wanted people who shared his type of education. And Pius had been educated and developed a great respect for the Jesuit model of education. So one of the books that does refer to this diary is Robert Ventresca's book on Pius XII, but it's one of the very few. And the reason I mentioned Professor Ventresca is that he's registered for this this discussion. I've never met him myself, but I know his work. So the second question is why the title Jesuit Kaddish, which might confuse a lot of people. And it comes out of a chorus of both Jewish and Jesuit voices. I didn't realize until I read it quite a few years ago, how positive this prayer Kaddish is. I had always connected to funerals and to mourning, and it is a prayer of mourning, among other things. But until I read it, I didn't appreciate that its spirituality is very similar to Jesuit spirituality. And there are very few, a Catholic could say this prayer fully embracing its praise of God. It's not, when I first turned to it years ago, I thought maybe it's going to be like that medieval chant, Dies irae, Dies ille, stressing judgment and condemnation. But that's not at all the case in the Kaddish. It's a prayer of praise. So I want to make that connection with the Jesuit spirituality. Now, maybe these days I should say something about what a Jesuit is, but I'm going to skip over that, because I presume most of the people who are with us today know at least what Jesuit is. But I've learned you can't really presume a lot of that anymore. Now, why did I choose that title? In part, the Jewish voices. I was very struck by a reference that the Holocaust historian Saul Friedlander makes in his magisterial work, in which he refers to a diary that was discovered at Auschwitz. And in the diary, it was one of the Jewish workers who kept it, and it was discovered after the war. He says that he always prayed Kaddish in a quiet voice after each of the gassings at Auschwitz. And it was an effort to bring a religious mourning, a religious significance to what seemed the most meaningless of deaths. A second voice, a Jewish voice, was an exhibit in Frankfurt I ran across a number of years ago, in which the exhibit said that the Nazi project could be understood as an effort to silence the Kaddish forever. And that phrase struck me a great deal. A third Jewish voice was that of Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, who pressed a question on his Jesuit friend, Gustav Weigel. And it's a question, a series of questions that has stayed with me ever since I ran across it as so significant. I've shared with many people who all of a sudden it makes dramatic sense to them. And this is a quote, Rabbi Abraham Heschel. Is it really the will of God that there be no more Judaism in the world? Would it really be the triumph of God if the scrolls of the Torah were no longer taken out of the ark and no longer read in the synagogue, our ancient Jewish prayer in which Jesus himself worshiped, no more recited, the Passover Seder no longer celebrated in our lives, the law of Moses no longer observed in our homes? Would it really be ad majorem Dei gloriam to have a world without Jews? End of quotation. And I was very struck by the fact he used the term ad majorem Dei gloriam, which is the model of the Society of Jesus. Now he's speaking to Gustav Weigel, who was a pioneer, American pioneer in ecumenism. But it made his questions there made a direct interrogation of the society's thinking. Because was the ambition to silence the Kaddish and Jewish prayer really that distant from the Catholic ambition to surpass Judaism and convert the Jews? That's a question we all live with. The whole notion of conversion of the Jews and its centrality to Catholic thought and Jesuit thought at the time. There were also Jesuit voices, though, that were encouraging me to use, to choose the title Jesuit Kaddish. And maybe they can be thought of as a reply to Rabbi Heschel's questions. Father Roger Brown, whom I knew in Paris, who was in the community with me, and who was recognized by Yad Vashem as a righteous of the nations, he had the Kaddish chanted by a rabbi at his own funeral. And then there was the Polish Jesuit, Stanislas Musio, who became a post-war leader in Jewish-Christian relations in Poland. And he too had the Kaddish recited at his funeral. And why did they do that? Is the question I had. Wasn't it to acknowledge this natural bond between Jewish and Jesuit spiritualities? A kinship that has been long, neglected in Catholic and Jesuit teaching and practice. Jesuits, of course, are members of the Society of Jesus, and Ignatius had fought many authorities to have Jesus become the name of our religious order. There were some people, you could probably recognize why, there were some people who felt that taking the name Jesus was a bit of arrogance. No, nobody else was taking the name Jesus as their basic identity. They were presuming that nobody else would do it either, but we did it. And Ignatius insisted upon it. And what I try to do in one of my chapters on Jesuit spirituality is on spirituality is to focus again on Jesus and the Jewish Jesus, which we have so much greater respect for today than we did earlier. We never rarely focused on the Jewish Jesus, and also I focused on the Jewish Mary, Miriam, who is perhaps a neglected bridge between our traditions. But my title does try to affirm the mutual world-affirming mysticism of both Jewish and Jesuit spiritualities, and our mutual fate as finite creatures. So I was very happy with the title. It came to me suddenly, and as so often those things do. And I hope others like the title as well. The third question: were the distinctive traits both to Jesuit and Jewish hostility, as well as to internal Jesuit criticism of that hostility? And I believe there were. With respect to Jesuit anti-Jewish hostility, there was what I refer to in the book as asemitism, as the basic path that Jesuit thinking followed. And asemitism is the ability to imagine a world without Jews. It's not an embrace of the violent anti-Semitic attitudes of so many in Western culture, but it's a call for separation between Jews and Christians. That doesn't mean that there weren't some Jesuits who did embrace a vulgar anti-Semitism. There were, and the journal La Civiltà Cattolica in Italy is usually singled out for that vulgar anti-Semitism, even though if you look at the history there, and an historian in Copenhagen has made us aware of this, most Jesuits at that journal were opposed to what the journal was saying about Jews. But there was one person who had great influence in Rome who managed to block any sort of criticism of his viewpoints. Now, asemitism was in part behind the decision early in 1593 to ban those of Jewish ancestry from entering the Jesuits. And I refer in the book to it as the original injustice, because it explicitly overturned the strong commitment of our founder, Ignatius of Loyola, to Jesuits of Jewish ancestry. And the estimate of some historians is that 20% of the early Jesuits were of Jewish ancestry. And Ignatius's successor as the second leader of the Jesuits was of Jewish ancestry himself, Lainez. But this ban, and there are a number of reasons why the ban was adopted, but the ban created a virus, I think, in society, that Jews could be just made to disappear. They disappeared from the order, and of course, this is a Spanish order, so the whole expulsion of the Jews from Spain, it set up a mentality that you could create a new situation on the ground. And that was sort of the ambition of many with respect to the Jews. That prohibition did not get eliminated from Jesuit discipline until 1946. And it's certainly connected to a post-Holocaust remorse. And it's interesting that several of the most distinguished critics of that Jesuit hostility and who were resistors were elected members of that, what we call congregation, that rescinded the prohibition on those of Jewish ancestry entering the Jesuits. Among them, Henri de Lubac and the German resistor Augustin Rusch. The implication of asemitism is great, that it sort of puts the Jews outside our moral and spiritual universe. And it's connected with a strategy, a wider Catholic strategy, which probably hasn't been paid attention to adequately, which is that it's called victory Catholicism. It's the sense, it's the judgment that what's wrong in modern civilization is that Catholicism is weakened. And it's been weakened by modern forces. But it's not racism. And this is where this us-Semitism is very different from the anti-Semitism of the Nazis. It's not a racial claim. It's a claim that Jews' presence after the Enlightenment, after the emancipation in Europe, is creating a weakening Catholicism. And so the whole idea is to get back to a strengthening of Catholicism itself. Now, as to the other side of the question, namely, were the distinctive traits to the internal Jesuit criticism of the polemic? I think there were. And the one that stood out for me most is Jesuits who became scholars of Scripture took on a different mentality. And they grew in understanding both what Scripture was really claiming, as opposed to the mythologies of Scripture, but also they developed a terrific appreciation for the Jewish Scriptures. And those are the people who became very central to the changed attitude that came out in Vatican II. One of them is Bonservin, Joseph Bonservin, a French Jesuit scholar who was very ahead of his time, early 20th century, who was silenced by the Jesuit leadership at one point because they thought he was too favorable to Judaism. And the other was the German Cardinal Bea, who was such an important influence on the Vatican Council II and its change of Jewish teaching. And that's why the cover of the book has Bea and Rabbi Heschel, both of whom were Scripture scholars. And one of the things when I was writing the book, and I didn't feature this at all, but one of the things I realized in thinking about this and the influence of these of these Scripture people was that they developed friendships. They had to relate to one another across denominational lines. So Jews and Catholics were speaking to one another because they were dealing with the Scriptures. And that made a big difference. It made a big difference, I think. The second group that I would point to in terms of what's distinctive about the critique of the polemic were those Jesuits who stood up, especially the ones who are honored by Yad Vashem. And I want to mention that there were 15 Jesuits honored by Yad Vashem. Yad Vashem is a very stringent program, and probably many more could be added. But I want to pay tribute to Vincent Lapamato of Holy Cross, who was way ahead of me in identifying a good number of these Jesuits. Because in the archives in Yad Vashem, they're not listed as Jesuits. So you have to go through a lot of dossiers to find out who these people are. But as of now, we have identified 15. But what was strongly clear in dealing with these individuals is that they had a deeper sense of humanity. They were not thinking in terms of ideological, national, religious, or party affiliations. They somehow had a sense of humanity, despite all the rhetoric that they've been exposed to in the course of their education and general life in Catholic culture. And they're the ones who most interest me right now, how this develops this sense of humanity in religious people. And in my book, I have an appendix with all 15 of them, their biographies. And they came from different countries. Belgium, France, Hungary, Italy. One was even a cardinal. So that's an appendix I'm very proud of for having put together. My fourth question, and this is where I'll stop, I think. What were some of the surprises that surfaced in my research? And there were quite a few, as you can imagine, when you're working on a project that's multi-year project. It wasn't. This has been off and on for me for quite a few years. I'd go back to my childhood actually for its ultimate source. When I grew up and saw people with those numbers on their arms sitting outside Fort Tryon Park. So what were some of the surprises? I'll mention three. One was, I actually went through, I had a research leave a number of years ago in Rome, and I actually went through the 11 volumes of documents that were published after the whole Pius XII controversy began. And they invited 4 Jesuits to go through the archives. Now the archives are opened, but they closed immediately because of the pandemic. But they went through, these 4 Jesuits went through all the archives and produced 11 volumes of what they claimed were the relevant materials. And this leave gave me an opportunity to go through those 11 volumes. I've met very few people who have read those 11 volumes. And I'm always astonished that they can speak with such authority. But one of the things that was most striking for me in reading through that is, and I did not understand that at the time, and it wasn't very well known at the time, it's better known now, was the cry of the Polish bishops pleading with Pius XII to speak out about what the German atrocities toward the Polish people who first experienced those atrocities at the beginning of the war. So the later charge about the Vatican silence during the Holocaust was actually preceded by this protest against the Vatican by Polish leaders, Polish Catholic leaders. And it perhaps gives a different sense, an appreciation for why eventually a Polish Pope was chosen. And at least if it's accurately reported, they're not supposed to leak any information about papal elections, but some of it is leaked, usually by somebody who didn't get it. But it was apparently the effort to have John Paul II named was led by the German cardinals. And so there's a history there that's not really appreciated. And that was a surprise for me, the Polish critique. A second surprise for me was the extent of the influence of anti-communism on the Jesuits who were in the German military. Now, there should not have been any Jesuits in the German military because Hitler had it's connected with the invasion of the Soviet Union. Hitler put out an explicit order that no Jesuits were to be allowed in the military. And I do have a section of my book which tries to account for the anti-Jesuit hostility of Nazi leaders. There's a book, very widely appreciated study of Hitler in Vienna, which says that he was much more opposed to Jesuits in Vienna when he was a young man than he was to Jews. And that's all connected to the Habsburg Empire and the fact that Jesuits were supporters of the Habsburgs and therefore of the international community that the Habsburg Empire represented, as opposed to, only Germans, which was Hitler's concern. So there shouldn't have been Jesuits in the military, but they were either because the German military officers in charge didn't appreciate that there were Jesuits, or the German military on the Eastern Front had other things to worry about than the religious identity of their chaplains. or the order of their orderlies. But what's striking, and there's a very fine book out in German on the Jesuit chaplains in the Wehrmacht. What's very striking is how anti-communism really shaped their perception. And what I find extraordinary is that anti-communism, the fact that the Jesuits, that there was this war against atheism, all right, somehow did not shape their perception of the Nazis. Now, they're Germans, of course, there's a nationalist feel. But it is striking looking at their documentation. And what eventually happened is when they started reporting back to their superiors about the atrocities on the Eastern Front, they got the order to identify themselves as Jesuits so they would be kicked out. Now that had it guaranteed I think the Jesuits wanted to stay away from the atrocities. They didn't want to be connected to that. But the other factor was they also left. One of the consequences is they took out some of the people who could have been most critical of what was going on when they saw the atrocities. And one of the complaints after the war by German soldiers was that their chaplains seemed to give them no guidance about the evaluation of this war. The third surprise for me was some of the weakness of the leadership of the Jesuits, and more than weakness, the general of the Jesuits had very anti-Semitic feelings, Vladimir Ledikowski. And they were because of his conception that there was a relationship between communism and Judaism. And he was very fiercely anti-communist. So Ledikowski, I mean, there's no significant biography of Ledikowski, and he was general for a long time, into the Second World War, 1942, I believe he died. The other person I'd point to is Norbert de Boyne, who was put in charge of the French Jesuits, who were a very significant part of the order at that time. And he told them that they had to obey Marshal Pétain, that there was a legitimate French government and you had to obey it. Now, fortunately, large numbers of the French Jesuits did not obey him. But it's an indication of what the mentality was, the normality of what they thought was the normality of the situation. There were other Jesuit leaders who were very good. I mean, the German provincial in Munich was particularly good. And it's amazing he survived the war, because eventually the Nazis did arrest him and they found him. In conclusion, there might be a place, that's not my dog. We don't have a dog here. But in conclusion, there might be need for much additional research on the Jesuits during this period. And particularly, I think Jesuit leadership should come under scrutiny. I was very impressed this past April that the German bishops, I think in an unprecedented way, I think, did a study of their predecessors during this time. And they came out with a very good document analyzing their weaknesses. And the weaknesses were, I mean, among them, the inadequacy of the just war theory that people were working on, the social acceptance of militarism in everyday life. Third, the preoccupation with communism, which it just eclipsed the ability to criticize Nazism, because Nazism thought of it, was an anti-communist movement. And then the institutional, what the German bishops said was the institutional weakness of the bishops' conference. And they were pointing explicitly to the fact that every decree of the German bishops needed unanimous consent for it to be articulated. So in the case of, there was an effort on the part of some Jesuits to get the German bishops to come out with a document during the war on human rights. And it couldn't go anyplace. That in the midst of the war, the German bishops were not going to turn what they would have perceived of as turning against their country with the document on human rights. So my friends, I thank you for listening to me. Much more could be said, but I don't want to take away the pleasure of reading my book. I know some of you have already read it, which I'm happy about. So thank you for your attention.
Okay, thank you so much, Jim. And we very much appreciate having this summary of your book. We want to turn now, we have two people who've prepared responses, both of them coming from some different perspectives. The first is Susanna Heschel, who is the Eli Black Professor of Jewish Studies at Dartmouth College. And her scholarship focuses on Jewish-Christian relations in Germany during the 19th and 20th centuries, the history of biblical scholarship, and the history of anti-Semitism. Her numerous publications include Abraham Geiger and the Jewish Jesus, which won a National Jewish Book Award, and The Aryan Jesus, Christian Theologians and the Bible in Nazi Germany. She is also taught at Southern Methodist University and Case Western Reserve University. And Susanna, as you know, we've asked you to keep your remarks to 10 minutes or less, if that's possible.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you, and I thank you for inviting me. I want to say, first of all, Jim Bernauer, there's an honesty to your book that is often sadly missing in scholarship on religious communities under fascism in particular. As a study of the German Jesuits that is primarily focused on the era of the Third Reich, this is a book that seeks neither to blanket offer condemnation or simply praise, but to present an account of Jesuits who accommodated the Nazi regime as well as those who resisted and saved lives, but within a much larger context. And what I appreciate in particular about this book is that it combines research, serious research, with profound soul searching. Now, we, I think, are all familiar with the fact that Jesuits were sometimes viewed as Jewish. Jesuits, Jews, Freemasons were often put in the same pot. We were often described as secretive, cunning, manipulative, greedy for both material goods and also for world domination. Catholics and Jews were conflated with Bolshevism, in particular Jesuits. Jews can sometimes also make this connection. Moses Mendelssohn, in his book, the 18th century book, Jerusalem, speaks of Jesuits and hypocrites in one phrase. But there are also very positive ways we're linked. We're committed to our devotion, to study, to Talmudic thinking, to intellectual life combined with spiritual growth. And we see that already in the spiritual exercises. Now, in the modern period, things become very much intertwined, and I want to say a couple of words about that. Jesuits and Jews are seen as intellectual, legalistic, but also as independent bodies, that is, in some sense, accused of being a state within a state, a community that is also, would you say in German, a Sippengemeinschaft, as well as a religious community, leading to the question of whether we are a religion or a race as Jews, and implied, but not in that language, about Jesuits as well. Now, I want to just mention two incidents that brought us together politically in this modern era. The first is the 1872 law in Germany expelling Jesuits from Germany that was part of the Kulturkampf. And then the opposition to that law in the debates in the Reichstag from Jewish representatives from the National Liberal Party. It was after the bill passed as law that Jewish newspapers began to argue that such laws actually meant a threat to the Jews as well. It meant that the state could deny civil rights on the basis of religious belief. So we were linked in the Jewish narrative of this law that banned the Jesuits. The second incident is the Dreyfus Affair, which is a complicated and still not yet fully dissected affair by historians. The first history of the Dreyfus Affair was written by a Jew, Joseph Reinach, who argued that Edward Drummond, one of the leading anti-Semitic figures of the era, had been a puppet of Jesuits, and that Drummond's anti-Semitic campaign had actually been orchestrated by Jesuits. The Jewish press picked up on this and endorsed and popularized Reinach's account, in many ways hurtful to Jesuits, but also to Jews. What's ironic about this is that Joseph Reinach's own father had been a financial advisor to the French government during the Panama Canal scandal of the 1880s, one of the things that actually gave rise politically to the Dreyfus Affair, and that it was this father who gave Edward Drummond the names of members of the French Parliament who had been suborned. And that is what made Drummond's newspaper, La Libre Parole, hugely popular in the first place. But this brings us to a contemporary issue. Hannah Arendt has made it clear that the problem with the Dreyfus Affair was not only the anti-Semitism, but also the widespread absence of support for the French Republic. The failure to articulate a commitment to the Republic, she argues, is what led to the Vichy regime. And I would say that we have the same situation today. I hear people calling for the United States to be a Christian country, for example. But the problem that we have is that we need a well-articulated commitment to our own Constitution and our Bill of Rights that will come from both ends of the political spectrum. Now, a word about Jesuits and anti-Semitism that Jim discusses in his book. He points out that Jesuits are preachers, writers, and teachers. But he questions whether what he calls a nonviolent indifference blinded Jesuits to the growth of anti-Semitism. He points out that on the one hand, the spiritual exercises of Ignatius do not focus on negative images of Jews or on fantasies of Jewish cruelty toward Jesus that can be found in other Christian meditative traditions. And yet, he says, the Jesuits also erected a wall against the modern world that could easily slide into ugly anti-Semitism. He expands that point, and I think it's important, and it's also very creative the way he goes about it. That is, Jim examines the role of misogyny in fostering negative theological attitudes toward Judaism by linking Jews with the feminine. He writes that the renowned Jesuit journal, La Civiltà Cattolica, included hideous anti-Semitic and misogynist articles and may well have provided fodder for the Stürmer, the notorious Nazi anti-Semitic and semi-pornographic newspaper. For this, Bernauer calls us to pay attention to what he says is the church's disproportionate focus on sexuality, because sex opened the door to anti-Semitism. There were strange elective affinities around sexuality between Nazi anti-Semitic propaganda and Catholic moral teaching that led some Catholic theologians to view Hitler, mistakenly of course, as a force for moral renewal. And this meant that Nazism was experienced by some Catholics as offering a possible revitalization of the church and a way to overcome the dualisms of body and soul. And he points, for instance, to the renowned theologian Karl Adam. And this was easily translated into anti-Semitic terms. Jews were carnal, lacking spirit, and were viewed by Nazis as sexual predators, dangerous polluters of Aryan blood, and enemies of the German spirit. So Bernauer argues that sexualizing and Judaizing were in an unholy alliance, as he calls it. And that's a very original and important point of this book. Now, Jim also points to something different, which is the tradition of Jesuit scholarship that had developed a unique regard for the Jewish roots of Christianity and the unity of the Bible. We don't find the kind of neo-Marcionism or denigration of first century Judaism in order to elevate Jesus that we find in liberal Protestant scholarship. And it may be also the Jesuits have a different sense and a broader sense of the very purpose of scholarship, that scholarship must serve the soul as well as the mind. I conclude just with a quick couple of concerns. One is the problem, it strikes me, that Catholics in Asia and Africa are not necessarily always interested in Jewish-Christian relations. They see it as a European or American issue, and I think we need to convey why this is, in fact, an international issue theologically. There's much left to uncover. I think about the word kraspedon in Greek, that refers to the fringes worn on Jewish men's clothing. But when it's translated in the Gospels, Jesus is said to have the hem of his cloak is krasbedon, and that's what the woman with the flow of blood touches. In other words, there's a de-Judaization process already in the translation of the Greek into various languages. Jack Miles in the chat has asked the question, is there an asemitism in the doctrine of the incarnation understood as God becoming man instead of God becoming a Jew? Is the doctrine of the Immaculate Conception of Mary, or was it intended at the time to deny her Jewishness or to separate her from Jewish parents? All of these are continuing questions, but I think what is so wonderful about Jim's book is his conclusion, his Kaddish. His page of Kaddish at the end is a call for repentance and also a call for renewal. He speaks about sins against God as well as against Jews, about the failure to meet Judaism as a living religion. In the way he writes this, and I urge everyone to read it, I see this as a step forward from Nostra Aetate that brings us into the future. And yes, Jim, you quote what my father said, ad majorem Dei gloriam, to Gustav Weigel in his office, for the greater glory of God, the motto of the Jesuit community. That phrase is something my father also used to say to some other people, by the way, including Bill Coffin at a Shabbat table. But that phrase in itself, I would say, is in fact the essence of the Kaddish, because the Kaddish doesn't mention God per se, but it speaks about making room in our world, greater room for the presence of God. And so I would say, perhaps in conclusion, what is our purpose and the purpose of your scholarship, Jim, which is, of course, to give us a good history, but also, more than that, to point out to us that we are here ultimately to enhance one another's faith and to make more room for the presence of God in our world. I thank you for your book, and I urge everyone to read it.
Thank you so much, Susanna. We turn now to our second and final respondent, to the Reverend Brett McLaughlin, who is a Jesuit from New England, from Western Massachusetts, and from Maine. He joined the Society of Jesus after graduating from the College of the Holy Cross and serving as a U.S. Air Force intelligence officer. He studied philosophy and theology at Fordham and Santa Clara University, also teaching at Cheverus High School in Maine. His studies focus on contemporary Christology as seen through the anthropology of René Girard and his Swiss colleague Raymond Schwager.
Good afternoon. I was delighted to be invited to this book launch situated in a critical era for the Jesuits and millions around the world. To be clear, I am not responding as a representative on behalf of the Society of Jesus, nor am I a Jesuit historian. I am one example of a recently ordained U.S. East Coast Province Jesuit, and I will try to speak out of those experiences while engaging with Professor Bernauer's Jesuit Kaddish. The study of Jesuit history is a vital component of the Jesuit novitiate, oft continued in coursework or seminars in the years of formation afterward. Over a 500-year legacy, the moments that receive the greatest attention are the first companions, including Ignatius's own biography, the missions to South America, India, and the Far East, the suppression and restoration, and in the northern US, the North American martyrs from France. Father John O'Malley's works are held in particular regard in the United States, as he taught great numbers of our current leaders at Weston School of Theology and continues to publish. Major anniversaries of the suppression and restoration were celebrated in the past decade, causing numerous publications and lectures. It is simply the wide extent of this 500-year legacy on multiple continents that I attribute less attention and scrutiny of the societies in 1930s and 1940s Europe. All Jesuits today would be steeped in the landmark Nostra Aetate and likely the grave issue of supersessionism. During philosophy studies at Fordham, I wrote on the implicit supersessionism found in the liberation theology of South African Dominican Albert Nolan. Supersessionism constituted a whole class in a Christology seminar. I would later have classes with the great interreligious scholar and McGinley chair, Father Pat Ryan, on comparative theology of faith. At Berkeley in theology studies, the comprehensive exam features key questions on the declaration of the Church on non-Christian religions. In my licentiate studies at Boston College, we would investigate it in even more detail in a course on religious pluralism, as well as disasters of interreligious conversations and expulsions. Whereas Ignatius of Loyola is upheld to revere Jewish heritage, the history texts of my era acknowledge the capitulations of the Society to discrimination in 1593 from cultural pressures. Jean Lacouture's 1995 text, Jesuits, a Multibiography, portrays Ignatius's welcome to the Hebreos, quote, constantly alert for attempts at exclusion of Jews by the Spanish Church, constantly ready to recall Christianity's Jewish origins. He never failed to reveal his feelings over the injustice of the measures initiated against Jews by those responsible for the 1492 edict and by the royal courts of Valladolid and Lisbon, close quote. The Cardinal Archbishop of Toledo offered many privileges to Ignatius should he follow the standard exclusionary practice. Instead, new Christians were, quote, regularly admitted, no matter what the reaction of this or that of his companions, close quote, popes or Spanish court. The 2008 Cambridge Companion to the Jesuits featured Ignatius' Conversos descendant companion, Diego Lainez, Jim referred to him, the second general of the Society of Jesus, quote, the Jesuits under Ignatius, Lainez, and Francis Borgia became known throughout Europe as a haven for new Christians, close quote. Ecclesiastic and cultural pressures would overcome this pluralist framework for the Society of Jesus as the fifth general congregation installed barriers to those from Hebrew and Saracen background. Several dissenters, such as Secretary Antonio Posavino and Jose de Acosta, believed racial equality should be a central tenet of the Jesuits as it pivoted to missionary efforts. John O'Malley notes that Pedro de Ribadeneira and Posavino believed it a betrayal of Ignatius and the spirit of the society. In terms of the perception of leadership, the effortless elevation of Lainez demonstrates that, at least internally, Jewish heritage Jesuits were held in high regard. The Society of Jesus in Italy would continue to acclaim its new Jewish members. Sadly, restrictions on Jewish lineage would only be mitigated in 1608 and 1923, and as Jim mentioned, it wasn't removed until 1946. Appropriate attention to this unjust period for the society in Spain is now brought to light in Robert Alexander Merrick's 2010 book. Advancing to the 20th century, Professor Bernauer's examination of asemitism to Jewish persecution is warrant for pause and reflection. It is indeed startling to review the Jewish history of evading prophetic stance, instead imbibing the false menace of the Jewish population. That the Polish Jesuit journal counseled asemitism as the, quote, most effective and morally appropriate solution, close quote, is distressing, to say the least. I would not attribute such injudicious stances to Jesuit indifference or obedience, at least how it is instructed in the 21st century. In General Congregation 35, Decree 4 stipulated that, quote, love for Jesus Christ and the desire to follow him call us to trusting commitment, Commitment to the Word incarnate cannot be separated from commitment to the concrete mediations of the Word that are at the center of our lives, the church and the society, which exists to serve the church, close quote. The vow of obedience frees Jesuits from the cultural, exaggerated desire for autonomy and lack of commitment. As expressed by historian Joseph de Guibert, the character of Jesuit indifference is an indifference in the face of everything that is not the end. That is, all those things not in the service of God. Moreover, in the American context, the attentiveness to social justice is a robust mark of the charism and usually verbalized in the conversation of Jesuits. Many Jesuits participated in the Occupy protests, Black Lives Matter, and calls for police reform. The experiments of novitiate and formation repeatedly call for immersion into communities of the disenfranchised. I am disheartened in a different way that the legacies of Cardinal Bea, French and German resistance, and the Dachau Jesuit community have been neglected. For the many Jesuits who study or work in Rome, I would surmise that Cardinal Bea is well known. I do not happen to be one of those Jesuits. It is astonishing to hear him, Cardinal Bea, described as the, quote, director of the construction company, close quote, around Nostra Aetate and Pius XII confessor. Shifting to the war years, French resistor Jesuit Pierre Lausson appears to confront the racial currents resulting ideology in anti-Semitism. His editor, Pierre Chalet, as Bernauer puts it, quote, explicitly rejected silence and what he called a false prudence in the face of Nazi hatred of the Jews, close quote. Chalet himself rescued 108 Jewish children and enabled others to reach Switzerland. Whereas German priests Rupert Meyer and Alfred Delp are renowned, Joseph Speaker, Friedrich Muckermann, and Augustin Roche are mentioned far less. Muckermann and Roche's daring confrontation of the German bishops for failing to counter the Nazi regime would be moving for many young Jesuits. I was astonished to read Angela Merkel's own tribute to the Kreisau Circle in 2007 as the forerunners of a united Europe. Perhaps the most compelling feature of the book for me was to learn that a functioning Jesuit community of 96 members from 5 countries existed in Dachau. That spiritual conversation and fraternity existed in such a place for 4 years is a light in very bleak times. These 2 critical decades of the 1930s and 1940s, still so memorialized and investigated in the 21st century civil society, should be well known in the Society of Jesus for its failures and successes. Although volumes of Jesuit history have been steadily forthcoming, a standard from my novitiate, William Bangert's History of the Society of Jesus, passes quickly over the Second World War, mentioning only the expulsions of Jesuits from Spain and elimination of provinces in the Baltics and Central Europe. Focus quickly passes to the Second Vatican Council. Other than Professor Bernauer's own contribution, the 50-year series of the studies in the spirituality of Jesuits has no entries on this era. Few books have been published other than biographies of singular priests' ministry in the camps. Professor Bernauer's new volume brings appropriate and adequate attention to the Jesuit-Jewish relations in 1930s and 1940s Europe. It is my certain hope that it become vividly known era for the society. Thank you.
Thank you very much for a response that really fills in some substantial gaps in the discussion that we were able to have in the time available, and also adds to some of the things that Jim was able to include in his book. We'd like to give Jim a few minutes to respond, and then there are some people who have posted questions in the chat that we will then try to get to.
I just want to thank Susanna and Brett for their comments, which give me much to think about. And I prefer, I think, rather than responding, I could speak a lot more on in a response. I think it might be more valuable to know what people from outside have been sending in as questions.
Okay, so let me share with you, there are two questions that actually in many ways dovetail with each other that I think are particularly of interest to people. So Jack Miles early on asked that, said, is there an asemitism, or as Brett was saying, an asemitism in the doctrine of the incarnation understood as God becoming man rather than God becoming a Jew? And we could add to that what Susanna commented on, the emphasis on the Immaculate Conception, which essentially de-Judaizes Mary, and in that sense also then de-Judaizes Jesus. So in other words, did asemitism have any impact on Jesuit theology, especially in its expression of Christology and Christ-centered spirituality? So that was a cluster of questions right there. And then another asking whether a Christology that acknowledges Jesus's Jewishness from a Jesuit perspective, what that means for non-European, non-American Catholics. And seeing this as something important, especially for Jesuits, because of the international missions of the Jesuits and ministries, and also the number of Jesuits who are coming from Asia and Africa, places where there are not Jews for personal encounter. So let's start off with those small topics.
Yeah, I'm not going to do a doctrinal history here, but I mean, those are, I mean, certainly, I mean, much could be said on the whole notion of the incarnation and the Immaculate Conception. But maybe the more concrete question is the one that both Jack and Susanna mentioned herself, namely, in a world that's becoming less Eurocentric, and when there's been talk about a world church and less European church, this history may seem a distant history. That, and you know, I've noticed this myself in terms of the key issue seems to me, I mentioned in terms of the scripture, but it's a more general problem. If people don't meet Jewish people, fantasies develop. And fewer people are meeting Jewish people, it seems. I mean, now it goes, I'm privileged, I come out of the East Coast of the United States, and it's the second largest concentration of Jews in the world after Israel. And I felt very privileged by that situation. But I've mentioned to our leaders, for example, in the province of the East Coast, well, what are we doing in terms of Jewish-Christian relations? And it's not, at least one leader, it was not on his horizon. And he's living in the midst of this world. And, you know, it's an example of how you can live in a culture and not really, you know, you're parochial. And there's still a lot of parochialism in the Catholic world, I think. And I think in some ways, as our schools decline in numbers and people attending them, especially in the grammar schools, there's going to be much less of a focus on Jewish-Catholic relationship. And I don't know, we used to, for example, you know, we used to have things like we'd go, when I was a high school kid, we would go to an Eastern Orthodox church to experience their liturgy. What is it like? Totally different. We never went to a Jewish synagogue, but we certainly could have, and we should have. But I think, and this is a problem, classic problem that Jewish scholars know and Catholic scholars know, that there's such a focus on the scriptures that all the last 2,000 years of Judaism is neglected. And I've seen this, you know, I think Ruth and Camille would agree with me on this. I think one of our least successful operations at the center has been an outreach to the School of Theology and Ministry students that they, I think, feel, well, they know Jewish life because they've done scripture studies, But post-biblical Judaism is very unknown. Now, part of it is the whole issue of history, whether historical, like Brett was saying that, Bea, I'm speaking to you, by the way, from Bea House, which is my Jesuit residence at BC. But there are very few Bea houses. But I've been struck by younger Jesuits who don't know who Bea is. Now, other Jesuits tell me, well, why should you think they would know? I mean, this happened in 1965. It's a long time ago. Bea's been dead for decades. And because of my particular interest, I know Bea, and other people who have lived through that period know Bea. But we shouldn't be surprised that Bea's name has sort of vanished but there is a concern about how we can communicate Jewish experience and our history with Judaism to this world of non-Jews, which is most of the world. And it's a problem that faces both Jews and Catholics, how to do this. It's not easy, it seems to me. Susannah wants us to speak, yeah.
Oh, thank you. I just want to say what's striking about Cardinal Bea, and that, something perhaps we need to treasure about him, is the fact that he did have a broad learning of rabbinic Judaism, for instance. He and my father both studied with the same person at the University of Berlin, Eugen Mittwoch, who was a Jewish professor of Semitics. And when my father first met Cardinal Bea, he brought to him as a gift an edition of a midrash, a rabbinic commentary, that Bea appreciated because he had prepared a critical edition of that text himself. So just to respond in this way to what you're saying about knowing post-biblical Judaism, there was a time and there is a time, and I think that that's also an example of what Jesuits bring to Catholicism, to the Catholic Church, that is this deep devotion to scholarship, to learning, and that Cardinal Bea was chosen to be in charge of creating Nostra Aetate is also a tribute to the Jesuit order. And it's also one of the great things that the Jesuit order has contributed to the Catholic Church and to the Jewish people. So I agree with you, he should be certainly remembered and emulated as well.
Thank you. The other thing, if I could just add one footnote to that, is Bea grew, and this is one of the things that I'm fascinated by, how people grow, because he had some very narrow perspectives earlier in his career. And he had to grow in his understanding of Judaism. Now, being a scholar, of course, of scripture helped him. But even later, there were these inclinations that were, that showed an earlier history where he was suspicious. Like he was very strong, this is the 1920s, he was very strong about intermarriage. Now he meant Protestants and Catholics. They shouldn't get intermarried. But he had very strong prejudices that were reflective of that period. And he grew, and it's amazing. I mean, I think he probably grew through people like dealing with Heschel, who I didn't want to mention that, this was Susanna's father. I feel with Susanna always touching history. It's a remarkable possibility we have listening to Susanna, I think.
Right, there's another question. This comes from Christine Helmer, who was one of the holders of our Corcoran chair, picking up on a topic which in some ways is coming out of Susanna's reflections also. She said, I would love to hear more about why sexualization and feminization became key polemics against Jews. What does this say about appropriating particular ideas of masculinity and sexuality for Roman Catholics or Jesuits? Why is sex so significant for opening the door to anti-Semitism? Just a narrow question again.
It's a good question. It's something, Susanna also mentioned this in her remark. And it's something I slid over because it becomes more convoluted to discuss what I speak of in the book as the dualism that was such an albatross around Catholicism's neck. And the Jesuits fell into that same dualism. And sexuality became so central a focus in the way Catholic piety and Catholic theology thought about what it meant to be a disciple of Jesus. And it's on one level, it's a great mystery to me that it managed to hold on so long. I think it's pretty well dissipated now in terms of, at least in the eyes of many Catholics. I mean, but if you, and I think part of it might be the fact that papal infallibility was declared, and so many issues were considered settled as a result. Let the Pope speak. But the fascination with sexuality and the misunderstandings of incarnation, we could go into incarnation, that in some ways, it's very much of a heresy, much of what's being said about sexuality by Catholic thinkers, that it doesn't reflect the incarnation. And one of the most interesting books I've read was, and this is, I have to admit, my other hat is my Foucault hat. That's where I've done my scholarship in philosophy. And I consider that a great privilege, having studied with him for 2 years. Of course, he was working at the time on the history of Christian sexuality. So that's influenced the way I think about some of these matters. But yeah, the impact of discussion of sexuality. One of the most interesting books I was mentioning is by a historian of art, Leo Steinberg, the late Leo Steinberg. And he has a book called The Sexuality of Christ in Renaissance Art and Modern Oblivion, that Jesus was desexualized too, even though the whole notion of incarnation is that God and humanity are one. And Steinberg has I think it's a really fine book. Some people are appalled when I recommend it, so I'm always cautious in whom I recommend it to now. Because it was my last communication with Michel Foucault was I sent him a copy of it, because he was working on Christian sexuality at the time. And he thanked me for it. And he said he's going to arrange for a French translation. I don't know if it was ever translated to French, because he died shortly after that. Yeah, this is, I mean, I cite the Handbook of Pastoral Theology in German, which speaks of Christian sexuality, the teaching about it, as a pathology. And often it is a pathology. And one of the books I recommend to people, I mentioned Jim Keenan, who's a professor here at Boston College, as really confronting this issue of dualism. But the other person is Mark Jordan, whom I've recommended to many people. His book on the ethics of sex is a very intelligent effort to get beyond this dualism and this obsessiveness with sexuality. But much more could be said. And I thank Christine for the question, because I know she's done quite a bit of work on Luther and misogyny too.
Yeah, so Susanna asked me if she could respond to this also, and then we do need to wrap up because we're already past our time, our official time. And we want to give people a chance to come onto the grid, and so Jim can really see your faces and see that you're here also. You can say hello to him in person.
Come back, those.
Briefly.
Oh, thank you. I just want to say that I found that an extremely interesting and original part of your book, and I think it's a question that needs to be pursued much further. And I know Christine also works on this, but the larger question of how the effort to create an ascetic life, how to regulate sexuality, how to keep oneself religiously pure using the metaphor of purity was related in the early church to the effort to distinguish Christianity from Judaism, certainly. And I think in your book, you make some very interesting points about the concern about sexuality that was so important, not only to Catholics and not only to Jesuits and Catholics, but also to Protestants, that easily slid into what became a Nazi obsession with Jews, let's say, causing impurity of the German collective body, the national body, through their very presence. So I just wanted to point out that I think this is an important element of your book that I found particularly creative and interesting and provocative. I think we need to all be careful and cautious when we engage in moral theology on a whole host of issues, and think about how our ideas about religiosity and morality will be received in the larger public, and what political implications might be drawn, even unintentionally so, from what we are arguing. So that was an important point of caution. What are the political implications of our moral theology in a world today that is so terribly polarized and full of so much resentment and anger? We need to tread gently and carefully when we do speak theology, words of theology and morality. So you in that section, I think you have actually laid the groundwork for dozens of more books on this topic, and people will be following in your footsteps, Jim. So I thank you for your book.
Thank you so much.
So let me thank first of all, but the respondents, Susanna Heschel and Father Brett McLaughlin. And of course, Father Jim Bernauer, who is, we're celebrating his years of service to Boston College and to the Center for Christian Jewish Learning, and especially celebrating his book, which, as we hear, is going to be I think, a staple of a curriculum of thinking about Jesuits and Jews for many, many years. And it's opened doors to, let's say, at least 4 different lectures that could have been given and given in more depth today. We didn't have the time or the energy to do that much, but we could. There's so much to learn, and there's so many different directions to take this and to grow with it. So we thank you, Jim, for opening these doors and for just opening up what's really essentially a brand new field in thinking about the understanding of Jews by Jesuits and how this has shaped the Jesuit order itself.